What is up, everybody? I'm NoLucksGiven here with Lily for today's afternoon snap, and today we're going to take a look at two different tournament top fours, the first of which took place on Monday. So that's before White Widow was released into the game, and of course both of these tournaments took place before today's OTA patch. First, we're going to look at the fourth place list for Monday's tournament, and that is this mill list from Salieto, which is a pretty straightforward deck. I think that this is something most players are familiar with since the release of Baron Zemo. Just playing a bunch of cards to steal options from your opponent, and then Magic, which works really well with Red Hulk, which is going to get a small nerf today, but I think will still be a pretty powerful card. 611, just like starting stats, was like kind of busted. The fact that it hit a 615 with just one miss from your opponent, and now it's going to hit a much more respectable 613 from a single nerf, from a single miss, but will still be a 617 if your opponent misses twice. And your opponent has pretty good odds to miss when you are stealing all of the cards from their deck and making the game into a 7-turn game. So I think that this deck is still going to be quite viable and very powerful as the season moves on. I actually don't have the third place list or the second place list from this tournament. I can tell you what they were though. Third place was a Loki list. Loki is definitely going to be a big part of this video, and the third place list was a Black Knight discard list with both Red Hulk and Infinite, that kind of stuff. We'll actually take a look at a screenshot in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a look at the list that won first place here. And this is a list that I have apparently has been making some of the rounds. I have not seen it, but it's very interesting. Namely the Supergiant, which is not a card that I own, making some interesting plays here. And one thing that I want to point out, this isn't going to be the only list that we see Negasonic Teenage Warhead in, but this card is definitely picking up where Alioth has left off. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. The cards were always like pretty similar, with Negasonic potentially eating a lot of Alioth's lunch here. Now that Alioth does not do nearly the same thing that it used to do, I think that Negasonic is definitely a really premium choice when you have priority going into the final turn. You basically have to choose, do you want your opponent to still get the power of their card, aka you play Alioth and remove the card's abilities, or do you want their card to still have its potentially powerful on reveal abilities, but you take away all of the potential power from it? And those effects are just more powerful when you combine them with Cosmo and with Supergiant, which was a previous card that saw a lot of play alongside Alioth. Supergiant, I don't own it, as you can see, so I'm not totally sure about all of the ins and outs that Supergiant can pull off, but I do know it's good with Maximus, and Maximus plus Gladiator or Maximus plus Red Guardian are both really good curves, and you can also weave your Negasonic Teenage Warhead in there. A lot of 3-cost cards in this deck, to be sure, to fill off that curve. One other thing that I thought is interesting is you can go Supergiant into Annihilus and then play a turn 6 Sentry plus Maximus. And that'll just put out a bunch of power on the final turn of the game, and I think is a curve that a lot of people aren't expecting, and kind of masks your Annihilus Sentry play, which is otherwise a very telegraphed play in Marvel Snap. And then sometimes you're just throwing in a Ronin in there too, which can obviously get bigger with the Maximus. So you've got a lot of different flexible play lines here, and that was enough to get a first place for Sandville, and we will take a look real quick at this screenshot of them defeating Black Knight in the finals. This was the final game here. I'm not exactly sure what list was utilized here. I do think that Black Knight is a lot worse now that Zabu's been nerfed. I think that that was a huge draw to the archetype, being able to make Miss Marvel and Ghost Rider cheapers we can see in this screenshot, but also the Ebony Blade, Shang-Chi, and I think that this list hurts a little bit without Zabu. Of course, they're still playing Serra so that you can play multiple 4-cost cards on that final turn of the game, but that was not enough there for Doom Moon, and Sandville was able to take it. Unfortunately, I don't have any information from the Loki deck from this first event, but there's a bunch of Loki in this second tournament as well. Only one Loki list made the top 4, and that's all we're going to look at in this video. However, if you zoom out into the top 8 of this tournament, there were 4 more Loki decks. 5th through 8th were all Loki, which I think is really impressive and really noteworthy, especially because Loki is about to get what I think is the best card of this season next week in Marvel Snap. I'll talk more about that at the end of the video, but let's start here with the 4th place list from this tournament, and that is going to be, this list from Crazy M, which is kind of a crazy list, aptly named. Howard the Duck makes an appearance for the first time since I've been doing Marvel Snap tournament coverage since like November of last year, almost half a year at this point, and I did not think that we would ever see Howard the Duck put up some results, and it's really just they want more guarantees with their Iron Lad. This is an interesting sort of ramp deck. Sandwave is an archetype we've seen in the past, and Sandman is definitely a much more powerful card now than it was previous. White Widow actually had a pretty good performance. I mean, it's like a 2/6 if it works, and if it doesn't work because you're like playing junk, then it also kind of worked just in a different way. So White Widow I do think is a fantastic card. I talked about it a lot last week. This list is, so like I said, it's Sandwave, and it's ramping with Wave, Iron Lad, and then also Hope Summers, plus a bunch of cheap cards. And Howard the Duck is interesting because it's a cheap card to help you power out your big expensive stuff with Hope Summers, but it also gives you a lot of consistency to hit your expensive cards with Iron Lad. I think this is a really, really interesting package. Like I said, kind of crazy, but it's working here for Crazy M, and I'm curious if we are potentially going to see more Iron Lad in the future. Could we see Jubilee Iron Lad plus Howard and Hope? Could that be a configuration that we see in the future? I'm not sure, but it's very interesting. I feel like my camera and my computer are slowing down a little bit, but let's try to power through this. Lily, you're holding in there. You're doing good, girl. And here we have the 3rd place junk list from Wasele. Wasele is a very common name if you pay attention to Marvel Snap tournaments. This person is often putting up results, and this time with junk, Sans, Annihilus, and Sentry, both of those cards not to be seen here, and Lily is currently not to be seen, so let me crop this over. There we go. She's back in frame. In this deck, we've got Cannonball and White Widow. Cannonball has been seeing a lot of play alongside Professor X. We saw it last week in a Ravona list, and actually that list didn't include Cannonball. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was a typical like Sentry Annihilus junk. But now we have White Widow, and that is giving some interesting opportunity. I think that White Widow is really good with Professor X, so that's part of what we're seeing here, just because it kind of gives your opponent a quick clock. Just like really good tempo cards are good with Professor X because you can slam down the Professor in that same location, and that's obviously very good. And this deck is also just looking to make use of a bunch of various different junk effects. We've got both of the goblins. Interestingly, this is a type of deck that a lot of players predicted wouldn't perform well with the release of White Widow, just because if you know your opponents are playing White Widow, you're going to expect to see a little bit more Destroy and a little bit more Annihilus. And Annihilus also being like a good card in the mirror and things, and very good against these goblins and all of this junk. So it's really interesting to not see that come up. Again, we have the Negasonic Teenage Warhead as a great way to just overwhelm your opponent when you have priority going into that final turn. So that's really cool to see. And then just like some tempo stuff with some powerful junking. In second place from this event, we have Scarface with a deck that I have seen around once or twice, but is definitely a weird one. This deck uses Shauna and Debris in a very, very interesting way. The goal with these cards is to give you a cheap Mockingbird or, alongside Killmonger, a cheap Death. Now you could also get a cheaper Mockingbird with your Baron Zemo, and you can also get a cheaper Death with Yondu, potentially Nico, and Carnage. And this list is definitely looking to capitalize on opponents playing White Widow with the ability of Carnage to destroy them, Beast to bounce them, and it's just kind of like a weird and tricky deck. And honestly, it's something that I haven't quite wrapped my head around. I don't think that Mockingbird and Death are like the biggest payoffs, but I think that's kind of the point. This deck is kind of low to the ground. It's not doing anything super crazy, which is kind of the MO of Beast decks in general. This deck is just to operate playing like reasonable Marvel Snap. But I'll still be honest, I don't get it. Like, the deck is playing Yondu. So that's typically not something that we think of as like a super powerful card, because this isn't a mill deck. It's got Yondu and it's got Baron, but it doesn't have enough mill to hit the threshold where your mill is going to be relevant. Maybe if you Yondu and Baron with Beast, you could make something happen, but for the most part, you're probably not going to make it happen. So it's definitely a weird list. It does have some pretty good high roll potential when you are able to curve out and get that Mockingbird plus Killmonger on turn 5. That's the goal. Have a Mockingbird that costs only 1, 2, or 0, so that way you can play it alongside Killmonger, and then be able to play a free or at least castable Death on the final turn of the game alongside some other potential threats, and kind of keep your opponent guessing about where your potential power output is coming from. So really weird deck, I think, but it's been putting up some results and some players definitely like it. And it was good enough to get Scarface second in this tournament. But first place is going to go to the one and only Loki here. Let me disable Baron as well. And this was the Loki list played by Flishwap to a first place finish in this tournament. And Loki, I think, is definitely the story of the week. We looked at 5 different deck lists. 6 if you count the Black Knight list that we didn't really look at, but then there were 6 Loki lists among the top 4 and top 8 of these various tournaments, and that is a ton of Loki. And this is, I think, the most common build of Loki that we're seeing, with Snowguard and Agent Coulson both as cards that can generate 2, and then Cable as just really powerful, and just a really cheap rate on Cable right now for a 2/3. Cosmo is really good interaction. Loki decks always get to throw in a little bit of interaction as well, and now we see Cosmo and Shang-Chi with the either buffed or unnerfed Angela and Elsa. Both of these cards really strong, and that means that playing Kitty Pryde is worth playing in the deck, even if it's kind of anti-synergistic with Loki sometimes, and we aren't playing Collector in the list. Now, where I think this is really interesting, next week we have Valentina coming to Marvel Snap. And this is a card, I said it a few moments ago, this was my top pick for new releases this season. I think it slots really, really well into Loki and gives you another way to just throw out a crazy high roll with the curve of Quinjet into Valentina, into whatever Valentina gave you. A 6 cost card that costs 3 less, and you're able to play it on turn 3. Even if it has 3 less power, that's just going to be busted. And if it isn't, you can get rid of it with Loki, so there's some synergy there. More so, there is synergy in that It gives you a play with Quinjet, which is a card that you already want to be playing in the deck, but it also works really well on the curve to just go Quinjet, Valentina card, Loki, and I think that is something that is going to be really, really scary next week in Marvel Snap, especially because Loki is already putting up fantastic results this week. That's going to be it for me today. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm NoLucksGiven. Peace.